David. So I'm Leslie Penney. I'm a sales engineer at Involta, and I'm joined by Scott today. And this is who we are. I'll introduce myself first. And like I said, I've been doing this for a long time and doing this infrastructure and security, networking, compliance, and things for 30 plus years in a variety of industries, from entry level technician to senior management roles. And the idea of this topic today of governance is one that comes up pretty frequently and is even more important in the cloud era. So kind of look forward to talking about that a little bit more. And Scott, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody, and thanks for having us here today. Scott Evers, I'm an enterprise architect for Involta. My bio is on the screen there, but I guess let me say that is actually my photo up there. If you're looking at the video, we are the same people, but years of dealing with cloud governance failures have caused me to go crazy, apparently. So. But no, this is an area that I'm passionate about. I spent about 18 years working for a large A&D company, and was one of the leading architects as they went through their transition to or adoption of public cloud services. And through that, learned a lot of the gotchas, a lot of the pitfalls, a lot of the things most organizations don't think about as they make that transition. David earlier mentioned pesky developers, but let me say I started my career as a developer, so I resemble that remark a little bit. Cloud brings to the table the ability for people to innovate in ways that they haven't maybe historically been able to, by reducing a lot of the barriers it takes to go build and field a solution. And so, while that's great, sometimes that can lead to things going wrong. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is, how can these things go wrong, and how can an organization put a structure in place to try and prevent that a little bit. So.
Okay. So, wanted to talk about in general why governance is important. So I'm going to talk a little bit just kind of about the past and then turn it over to Scott to what's going on today. But in previous roles when I've dealt with cloud governance, I kind of go back to this idea of when we originally started doing virtualization, kind of early 2000s, and it had always been very hard to stand up a server. You had to buy hardware, get approvals. You bought a lot of components, network cards, and drive controllers and the actual drives, and you had to set everything up really manually. And so there was a very high barrier to entry to get anything done, even for IT. And then this thing called VMware started to come along. And it was like, how easy is it to create a server? You create an image and you just replicate that image one after one after one, and life was great and things were faster and everybody was happy. It was like, this it took a little while to adopt. It was really great technology. But then you started to figure out, like when it came time to true up your Microsoft licensing or your Oracle licensing or something, that there was indeed a cost because you've had this uncontrolled, this unchecked proliferation of servers, which drove maybe more hardware than you needed. It drove a lot of licensing costs you weren't expected. And so we had to build, as IT in general, in the virtualization world, had to build a lot of controls at that point around who could start up a server, who could create it, who held the keys, and how did we go about getting control of that. And it kind of took a long time to figure it out, but we did eventually get there where we had the controls around that. And we kind of bumped along in that realm for a long time. But then this cloud revolution, and I use that word purposely, really began to happen because this really took a lot of control out of the hands of IT and put it into the hands of end users. And you start talking about this, everybody hates the phrase, but shadow IT. There's a lot of loss of control. But today the risk is even greater because it's not just internal. People can set up these very, very powerful full data centers in Azure or AWS with just a credit card, and Scott will go over some examples of how dangerous that can be. So there's this idea of having to take that same model of putting governance around the VM world and just virtualization to the entire enterprise, not just the compute and the storage, but the networking, the security, access controls, and all that. So this is something we've been through before, but it's a bigger issue now with a lot more risk associated with it. So with that kind of as a framework to start, I'll turn it over to your main presenter here, Scott. And Scott, do your thing. Scott.
Hey, Scott, I think you're.
I can't hear you, Scott.
Sorry, mute fail.
There you go. Yeah, that was the phrase for the most used phrase for 2020 was, hey man, you're on mute.
Yeah, exactly. At least it wasn't, hey, you're not wearing pants, sit down. Sorry. So yeah, I kind of wanted to start with some governance fails, but I'm also interested as we talk about that, if anyone here on the call has some good examples of areas where ineffective governance in cloud led to a problem. Sometimes these are humorous, and hopefully we can bring a little bit of levity to that. But sometimes they're serious and could be firm ending in certain cases. Since we're talking about cloud, I use the analogy of different bad conditions that real clouds can bring to bear, right? Being thunderstorms, tornadoes, and derechos. If you're not familiar with that term, I'm based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and we had something, I had never heard that term prior to August of this past year. We had what has also been referred to as an inland hurricane of 140 mile an hour sustained winds from a really massive thunderstorm. That's a derecho. So hopefully that's not a good metaphor for anything anyone here has experienced with cloud going wrong. But we'll talk through that. And we'll talk about, if those horror stories haven't, driven the point home, we can talk about why governance matters. We'll dive a little bit deeper on the sentiment that Leslie covered around, governance in cloud is different than traditional IT governance. You don't necessarily have some of the sort of organic or natural controls in place when you start to, work in a democratized platform like cloud. So where does traditional governance break down? We'll then shift gears and start to talk about solutions rather than problems. So we'll talk about Cloud Center of Excellence and what that concept is about. And then we'll provide some getting started, I don't want to say tips and tricks, but things that, if you're already in cloud, and I've not yet seen an organization that isn't in cloud in some way, shape, or form. But if you're already in cloud and you don't have good, effective governance in place, here's some things to look at to get started. All right, so a bit of an eye chart here, but these are some examples I pulled out of the popular press. Let me say, I have seen in certain cases these types of issues manifest themselves, both in my prior life and then as well as organizations that we work with as our clients at Involta. So these things are real, and they're not anomalies. What's maybe more anomalous is when they hit the popular press and you see them on these sites, but these are things that, many organizations are struggling with and face. So, working left to right, AWS access keys being leaked in GitHub. So, if developers like to share, they like to participate in communities, but sometimes, access keys wind up in source code and then get published. This particular organization that's mentioned here, or I guess this blog post here is about what happens when your keys get leaked. I've seen cases where Amazon will detect a leak of keys and let you know before you've been breached that, hey, your keys are out there, you might want to go rotate them. But you need to know and have the right process in place to watch for those notifications and respond to them accordingly. Things go wrong when you get that notice and you don't. Did someone have a question? Maybe I just heard my own echo. Another sort of concept here is around outages. So, a lot of marketing out there will tell you the cloud never fails. Well, I presume most of the people on this call have worked in IT, and given enough timeline, everything is going to fail, no matter how much time, energy, and money you put into building a robust system. These common mode failures exist. Example I'll use from my past, as I mentioned, I worked for an aerospace company, and when you start to put flight critical components into an airplane, the level of fault tree analysis that goes on is absurdly high relative to anything I've seen in IT in my career, to the point where you're calculating failure modes and probabilities, and something won't fly unless it's a 10 to the minus 9 probability of failure. So a 1 in a billion failure. Yet we still see issues. The Boeing 737 was a great example of it, where failure conditions can cause planes to crash. So if that level analysis goes in and planes still have issues, how are we going to, in IT, insulate against that? And so I guess the key takeaway from this sort of horror story is, don't assume the cloud is bulletproof. Don't assume you'll never have outages in cloud. Understand what those outages may be. Understand your risk appetite, and we'll talk about risk a lot more as we get into the governance models, but understand your risk appetite and how much you want to invest in insulating against these types of failures that do happen. Probably one of the most common ones, and one of the most painful to see, is the notion of a leaky S3 bucket, right? So when you go into Amazon and you set up an S3 bucket, you got to click about 4 or 5 buttons if you're doing it through the console to make your bucket public, and you sort of slap yourself in the head and say, how can anyone go through all these steps and say, yes, I want to make it public, yes, I want to make it public, yes, I want to make it public, when there's private data in there? But it happens all the time. So from a process perspective, from a tools perspective, there are mechanisms to help avoid these types of things that you need to be exploring if you're adopting cloud in any serious way. And then the final one is very recent, but you've probably seen press reports about Parler, which is a generally conservative political online messaging platform that Amazon just recently announced they were going to terminate their service, in large part due to the riots that happened at the Capitol a week or two ago. Of course, the courts are now involved, and there's lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, Amazon shut them down for political reasons. So, as you're starting to deal with these, vendors that, have influence over your availability and your success in cloud, you got to understand that the different sort of vectors you have to plan for, the different DR scenarios you have to plan for, are expanding. So it's not just, is there going to be a fire in a data center? Is there going to be a natural disaster? It may also be something political, right? So as you're doing your risk assessments and those types of things, think outside of the box. Consider things that may not have been a concern in a traditional IT model, but now are a concern in cloud. So why does governance matter, aside from sort of, here's some disaster scenarios that we want to try and avoid? Well, if you think about it, what we're trying to do in a cloud world is balance risk with freedom. So, we talked about, democratization of IT. We talked about developers being able to go out and just build something and deploy it without any sort of oversight or involvement from others. That freedom is leading to unparalleled innovation. I've been in IT for about 20 years, and the pace of change, with DevOps and Agile and cloud, where we're seeing release velocities of, multiple times a day, is an insanely valuable change in how IT is delivered. but what comes along with that is risk, right? And so that risk can take many forms. It can be financial risk. Everyone's heard of or is afraid of the proverbial surprise bill from their cloud provider where something went off the rails and they spent $10,000 last month and now the bill comes due at $100,000 this month, right? So that's one aspect of the risk. Compliance risk is another big thing. Especially if you're working in a regulated industry. But I would say almost all organizations these days are regulated in some way, shape, or form, and compliance is a huge, sort of threat to, or non-compliance is a huge threat to your organization. Security, we saw that with the S3 bucket, right? So where historically it would take a village to go field an IT solution, and there were many people who had the opportunity to raise their hand and say, hey, I think that's a bit risky and there's something we should do about it. That's not necessarily the case these days. So how do we make sure that the solutions we're fielding have the appropriate level of security controls in place, so that we're not putting the company in jeopardy? And then finally, operational risk. So and I keep coming back to AWS because that's what I have most experience with, but it's the same for Azure, it's the same for GCP, it's the same for platform and SaaS vendors, right? You make a lot of assumptions based on the marketing material about how robust the platform is, but don't always believe the hype. Make sure you do the research to understand, how are they getting to that level of availability, and does it pass the smell test? But also, how am I leveraging these services? Am I leveraging them in a way that takes advantage of the high availability capabilities that are on offer to me? A great example, and I see this painfully, I see this fairly frequently. If you look at the Amazon guidance, whether it be architectural guidance or any other form of documentation they have, they talk about multi availability zone deployments, and nothing can be highly available in a single availability zone, because that's those data centers could go offline. As a matter of fact, their SLA doesn't even cover it if they lose an availability zone. It's expected that you, as the consumer of those services, have built your solutions to take advantage of multiple AZs. But companies out there still are building stuff in a single AZ. They're not automating the environment. They're not automating failover between AZs. And so then if there is an AZ failure, they're going to have downtime that they didn't anticipate. And Amazon's most likely going to say, we told you so, right? So, but over on the right, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on a subsequent slide, you start to see a model for what effective governance could look like in a cloud world. And I think the most important takeaway here is that traditionally, governance, IT governance has been solely the responsibility and the domain of your IT organizations, maybe with a little bit of security sprinkled in if they're separate from your IT organization. But as we move forward, we really need to start bringing in other roles from across the organization to help with that governance model, because IT is not in a position in all cases to be able to drive effective governance. So building that network within your organizations, building that partnership is an important thing, and we'll talk about that in more detail later.
Yeah, and Scott, if I could add just a little to that, just
Sure.
from personal experience, that linkage Scott just talked about is not only important to keep the organization secure, but it can really affect your overall operations. Prior to here at Involta, I was at a very highly regulated company. We were SOC, we were PCI, we were HIPAA, and there was a very tight relationship between IT, risk, compliance, business units, and those things all really feed in. That level of governance and that sort of team building, crossing areas, really becomes important when you look time to be audited. Like if you can show a record that you met monthly and discussed security issues and vulnerabilities, and there were takeaways and tasks, and those things were done, moving across the, making this compliance incorporate the organization really does grease the wheels a lot when you get into having, an auditor come in and say, your policy says this, prove that you're doing it. And so this is really key stuff, especially if you're in a highly, monitored or audited environment.
Thanks, Leslie. And in case anyone joined late, let me say I like to have these things be interactive. So if you have questions, at any point, jump in, send it through the chat. Go ahead and I'm not sure if it's raise your hand or ask to go on video, but whatever the case may be, let's have that dialogue. So to talk a little bit more about some points that Leslie introduced earlier, right? Things have changed dramatically as we've gone from a traditional on-premises or colo-based IT world to the cloud world. And we've also talked about the benefits of that as far as increasing the pace of innovation and breaking down barriers to solutions. But some of the natural gating process that we took for granted in that old model go away now. And so we've broken it down into 4 kind of primary areas: skill, finance, security, and facilities. There may be others, but these are the big ones that we see on a regular basis. So if I think about skill, you could ask, and you'd be right in asking, well, it takes skill to go deploy something to cloud. Absolutely it does, yes. But if you think about the number of disparate skills that need to come together to field a solution in a traditional on-prem model, you not only have an application developer who needs to understand what's the business requirement, what's the design, I can write the code, but you also had to have everything beneath that. So you'd have your database administrators, you'd have your infrastructure admins, your network admins, you'd have security, you'd have facilities, you'd have all these different roles that brought their skill set to bear. And so if I wanted to stand up a rogue IT shop, and maybe rogue is a pejorative term that doesn't apply here, but if I'm in the business and I'm not getting what I need from IT for whatever reason, but I have an opportunity and I want to go capitalize on that, historically you'd have to have a team of people with a very broad set of skills to be able to go field that solution. These days, if there's so much capability and so much of that burden is taken on by your cloud provider, it really is a relatively low bar to entry to have a team of developers, for example, go build the skills they need to get something functioning on a cloud platform. Finance is another key area where they're, historically, I want to go field an internet-facing application, and it's going to take 30 VMs, and it's going to take a database, and all these different components are going to be there. There's going to be some software licensing because I'm maybe using an analytics platform or a content management system, where I have a perpetual license that I got to go buy. And so those expenses bubble up and get attention very quickly, especially if they're capital expenses, right? Your finance organization will step in and say, you're trying to spend money on what? Why is IT not doing that? Well, now, especially with utility-based pricing, I may start out on my expensing a virtual data center on my corporate card for a few bucks a month, as I build this thing, and then I go live and the usage scales, and now all of a sudden I'm spending thousands and thousands of dollars, and my my solution's falling on its face or being breached by adversaries. But no one stopped me in finance like they historically would. Security is another one. In the old model of security, you had your perimeter firewall, and you may have gone beyond that and had segmentation within your network, but there was always a big firewall at the perimeter. And if I wanted to expose a service to the outside world, or I wanted to go connect to the outside world in certain cases, I had to go to security to ask for firewall configuration to be put in place. Well, that was always a good catch point, where security would say, okay, why are you not working through IT for this? And they would kick that into that governance process. And then finally, the data center was always a big thing, unless you wanted to run your service under your desk, which does happen, right? But if you go buy, if you go buy a 50K server and you got past finance somehow to get that 50K capital spend, you're going to have to rack it somewhere. And that's in a data center that's controlled by your facilities organization or your IT organization. But, it will set off alarms and bring attention to these things that are going on. So all these things have gone away now. They're no longer barriers to entry, which is, what's leading to a lot of these groups going out, fielding solutions with the best of intentions, but not having the involvement of the right people to understand how to do it properly. So let's talk about, a model to maybe address some of that. So what we're introducing here on the slide is the concept of a cloud center of excellence. Now, in case someone here wants to go learn more and is going to go out and Google this, I'm gonna call out that there are two sort of prevalent definitions of cloud center of excellence in industry. One, which is primarily perpetuated by Amazon, is the notion of the two pizza product team that can go, a small team that can go build a solution and bring it to market. That's not the version of Cloud Center of Excellence we're talking about here. We're talking about the version that you hear from the different industry analysts like the Gartners and the Forresters of the world, where a Cloud Center of Excellence is an organizational governance body. So if you see here, we've sort of called out specific roles that are important in an effective cloud governance model. All of these people are stakeholders. All of these people have some skin in the game as far as having to deal with the aftermath if there's ineffective governance, and all of them have the ability to help drive governance within your organization. So I'll work the wheel sort of counterclockwise from the top left and talk through sort of what the role of each of these individuals or roles are within an effective governance model, and then maybe call out a few examples of where these these roles need to get out of their silos and work together as a team to solve some problems. So over on the left, you see really kind of the business governance aspect of this. So vendor management, vendor management's important because where historically you would buy a perpetual license and maybe pay maintenance on a yearly basis, or you would buy some hardware that had a 5-year depreciation schedule. And so you deal with your vendors, on a once every several years basis. In the cloud world, you're continuing or renewing that relationship on a very frequent basis. So it may be monthly when I pay my bill. It may be more or less frequent than that. But having effective relationships with your cloud providers can pay many, many dividends. Circling back to the notion of the unanticipated 10x spike in my bill any given month. I've seen many cases where cloud providers will take pity on organizations who have those sort of oops moments and relieve your bill, but that's only on the table if you have those effective relationships with your vendors. Also, you want to make sure that your vendors are helping you identify where their clouds are being used within your organization, because you don't know what you don't know. You want to find out who all is using cloud, where is all of my data in various clouds, where should I be focusing my attention. Your vendors can help you with that, right? So maintaining that relationship is a very important piece of this. From an asset management perspective, asset management, it's not physical asset management like you're traditionally used to in IT, right? You don't have an asset tag that you stick onto a new server or a new switch as it comes in the door, but you do have virtual assets in cloud. You do have information assets in cloud. All of these things you want to track. The asset manager alone doesn't play as strong a role maybe as some of these other aspects that we'll talk about here, but they're in conjunction with some other roles. They're crucially important to success of your cloud. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Finance, always good to have finance on your side. But as you're shifting from an on-prem or colo model to a cloud model, there's going to be a lot of shift in, from a CapEx to an OpEx financial model. That's something you got to have your finance team on board with. They're the ones that can help you identify cloud spend that's outside of your sphere of control. They're the ones who can shut down cloud spend if someone goes rogue and it's a problem. So having them in your camp, provides a number of different benefits. And at the end of the day, they're trying to avoid that big, scary, unexpected bill as well. So there's a good synergy there. Moving to the bottom of the screen, this is really sort of the technology governance aspect of this. And this is what has traditionally fallen under the realm of IT and things that you're probably most familiar with, right? But architecture, your architects are gonna help identify which clouds are good platforms to go pursue. They're gonna help identify what best practices are for use and implementation on those platforms. And so they're really sort of the best practices engine in your organization. Engineering, is going to have to build these solutions. And so they'll be kind of the victims, so to speak, of some of this governance in certain cases. If there's, capabilities or features they need to put in place, but they're also helpful in helping you identify, through establishing monitoring capabilities and those types of things, what you need to know to understand when something goes off the rails. And then finally, operations. So, think about your NOC and your SOC within your organization. The instrumentation that gets put in place by engineering is useless unless someone's got eyes on glass and is actually responding to that. And so their role in governance is to sort of, help identify, here's where things are working well, here's where things aren't working well, here's where we have the tools we need, where we don't have the tools we need. But they're really the boots on the ground as far as enforcing your governance. And then over on the right, you have the compliance, traditional security and compliance area of governance. So you'll want to have your cybersecurity people developing the right policies and frameworks to make sure that solutions that are deployed aren't putting you at undue risk. Your internal audit organization, always a good ally to have, whether we're talking about cloud governance or anything else, but they will help you find the things that your external auditors are going to find and, head those off prior to there being a real finding. Leslie talked about this, earlier in his comments. But, if you think about an external auditor as an adversary class that, will harm your company by finding things, internal audit is your defense mechanism against that. And then finally, your governance and compliance organizations. And really what I'm talking about here, as distinguished from cybersecurity and internal audit, is more of think of it as a legal function. So maybe it falls under, your office of general counsel or whatever, but these are the people who are really, charged with understanding what are the regulations that apply to me based on what I'm trying to do and what my business is. What are the right interpretations of those requirements? And they partner well with internal audit to help you understand, are you meeting the requirements? Are you not meeting the requirements? But to take a step back and sort of look at this holistically, again, none of these groups can be successful in isolation. So, what we see be most successful in the companies we work with is when they have a board or a committee that, includes representation from all these different focal areas that's working together on a regular basis to address issues with cloud governance, not only trying to be reactionary to issues that have occurred, but trying to be forward thinking about, what could happen and how do we go get ahead of that. So, a good example of how these teams will work together, right? So asset management typically is the role that's looking, let me take a step back. So finance gets the bill for your cloud spend at the end of the month. And they have no way of knowing intuitively, yes, this is a valid charge, or no, it's not a valid charge, right? And so they need to partner with asset management to understand, is this legit, is this not legit? Now, when there are anomalies found or issues found, the asset manager sort of acts as that broker that pulls in architecture and engineering to say, hey, this went off the rails, last month. Here's what's driving the spend. Why is that, why is the utilization of that increasing, or why is the expense increasing? And really sort of becomes the orchestrator of that work to go, prevent that from happening again, or to optimize that spend. So a lot of different permutations. I could spend, the next 7 hours talking about different permutations of how these roles work together. But ultimately, I think getting that group together, getting that network built within your organization, and getting them focused on, risk mitigation without being too heavy-handed and stifling innovation is really the key to a successful governance model.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out here too, Scott, that this also works in smaller organizations. It doesn't have to be a 9-person committee. These can be collapsed. These can be roles within the same department. The important thing is to, maybe you grow into this someday, but it's a way of thinking about how to start. But you don't have to be a big company to implement this. Can you kind of talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that regularly, where, one person will fill multiple roles on this body. I think, when you think about internal audit and governance and compliance, a lot of times those are the same group within an organization, same people filling both roles. That's a common area where someone wears multiple hats. Architecture, engineering, again, if you have a small IT shop, you probably don't have a stable of dedicated architects, so your engineers are doing your architecture for you. These are all perfectly valid, fair things. Where I think, things start to get a little bit suspect, and you start to open yourselves up for issues, as if you start to combine across the business, technology, and compliance areas, right? So it's very easy. And, I've been in IT for 21 years now. I know we're all a bunch of introverts, right? So it's very easy for IT, and plus we're problem solvers, right? So it's very easy for us to say, okay, here's a problem, I can solve it myself. I don't need that help. But that's where things are going to fall down. So, whether it's one person filling 3 roles, or multiple people filling a role, make sure that you're partnering with the people in these organizations and the people the company has chartered with these responsibilities, because they will be of benefit to you. So how do I get started? If I have no governance or little governance, right? So one thing you want to do is discover your cloud footprint. I won't do it here just because of the format. But I love to ask groups of people as I'm presenting to different organizations, who's got stuff in the cloud. And these days, most people raise their hand, but there's always a few people in the group that don't raise their hand. And, my subtle message to them is, yeah, you do. You just don't know about it, right? I mean, I think back, 15 years ago, our employee recruiting feature was a cloud-based solution. That was before anyone had used the term cloud, right? But it was a SaaS service offered way back then, right? And it continues to grow and expand. So if you think that your company isn't using cloud, I would contend that they are, and you may not know about it. If you think to what extent your company is using leveraging cloud services, chances are you've got a picture of some of it, but you don't have the whole picture. So step number 1 is to really try and discover, what clouds am I using? What clouds are holding my data, have access to my systems? What clouds present risk to my organization? Those 4 different categories of risk we talked about earlier. And so there are a number of different approaches to do this, and I'm not going to try and prescribe one versus the other, because depending on the organization, your needs and your budgets and your maturity will drive which one makes the most sense for you. But CASB is one. I'm not sure if that term has fallen out of favor. I hear the acronym less and less, but ultimately, cloud access service broker, or a lot of, because this CASB capability has been pulled into firewall, or not firewalls, but proxy servers. Lately, it's become less of a marketing term, but ultimately, your security devices and your logs can help point you to what cloud solutions people are leveraging within your organization. This was a lot easier pre-COVID days, where everyone was connecting through your corporate network, and now they're all working from home or working remotely, and you don't have as much visibility. But there are breadcrumbs there. There's evidence there that you can use to go try and get your arms around, where are my employees or members of my organization using cloud? Financial, great place to go look at your adoption of cloud. So I mentioned earlier the proverbial, I'm getting started with Azure on my corporate card. You can absolutely do that. And so, looking at not only the sort of more formal spend line items in your ledger, but also, looking at those expense reports to try and understand, where am I spending money on software and IT services that I'm not aware of, to help get your arms around that. And a lot of the providers out there will help you with some categorization or some things like that that'll help you narrow your search. So you're not just looking at a 1,000,000-line spreadsheet trying to figure out what each of those 1,000,000 lines means. The other one, I touched on this earlier as part of the vendor management conversation, but your big cloud providers are an invaluable resource to try and understand where people outside of your knowledge but within your organization are leveraging those platforms. So if you go to Microsoft and say, hey, I need to know what are all my Azure accounts, they'll be able to provide you a list, and hopefully there won't be something that you're not aware of, but likely there will be. So make that a point to reach out to your account teams and ask them. I'm aware of what I'm doing. This is my subscription ID. This is my account ID. But they'll say, okay, well, there's these 14 other ones that are combining for $12 a month, which financially isn't a big concern, but security-wise, for $12 a month, you can set the house on fire. So first step, get your arms around what is my current level of cloud utilization. The second one is to reach out and start building that CCOE. So start to put together the story for why cloud governance matters. Start to put together the story for how these various roles play a part, and then start building those relationships, if you don't have them already, with those different roles, to say, hey, vendor management, I need you to help me in this way, and this is why it matters. And get them bought in, get them participating in the process, and get a regular cadence going. You'll be amazed the number of issues and good ideas on how to address those ideas come out of that group. Next, if you've got any maturity or any size, you've got a library of policies, standards, guidelines, all that fun controlled documentation that gets emailed out on a regular basis and no one looks at the updates for. I didn't say that out loud, but chances are the ones related to security and IT particularly, were written or last modified in an on-prem world. And so those things may change or need to be changed. So a good and this is something that, organizations, in my estimation, should be doing anyway on a somewhat regular basis. But, take a review of all of those policies and standards, understand where cloud has shifted the ground underneath them and they need to be updated, or what was there before still applies. And then finally is building those partnerships throughout your organization. So set aside the CCOE, right? Because that's one type of leadership that needs to be built. But also start to work more proactively with the product teams in your organization to understand, are you using cloud? Do you have plans to use cloud? What are you trying to achieve? And how can we help you get there? Because if they're developing any sort of technology, they've at least considered it, right? So better to get ahead of that and help steer them and assist them on the front end than to try and clean up later. So with that, that's the content Leslie and I had. Unless Leslie, you have any parting thoughts?
Yeah, my one parting thought here is, when we were preparing this, Scott and I were talking, and there's several ways that IT can be seen in the organization. One is something to be avoided, which is certainly you don't want. You can just be seen as a problem solver. Hey, this thing is broken, fix it. You can have the business come to you for advice and say, hey, we have this strategic issue. Can you help us figure this out? But these cloud centers of excellence and getting in front of these, I think, are a really great way from a leadership point of view for IT to get out in front of something and take something to the business and saying, this is an issue. Here are the risks, from security, operationally, financially, and so forth. And here's a model to solve it. Can you help us do this thing for the company? And so instead of being seen as a utility or as sort of an arm's length partner will call you when you need you, this is a great opportunity for IT to get out in front of something and make business aware of the problem and get them involved in solving it. And I think that's valuable. Oftentimes we talk about, in quote, being at the table. This is a great way to get there by being forward looking on something like this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leslie. So I guess with that in mind, we're happy to answer any questions, hear any feedback or thoughts you guys may have. We'll be here for some time to field all those. But with that, I'll stop talking and see if anyone has anything. All right, I don't see anything in the chat, so David, I guess I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, it looks like we don't have anything in the chat. We did have a bit of a networking session planned for this, with the wrap up. So that is an unmoderated session. So to hop over to that, we can also use that as a forum, meet and greet, and ask any questions there as well.
Thanks for the opportunity to be in front of you folks today. Appreciate your time and hope it was some valuable content.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you in the networking session.
All right, thanks, guys.